They gave the evacuation order at the third bell of the night watch, and I watched every living soul on Deck 12 turn and leave. It wasn't panic. That's what I need you to understand before anything else. The Vethera Imperial Garrison was not made up of cowards. The officers of the 7th Conclave Guard were professionals, decorated, tested, loyal to the institution in the way that soldiers who have served 20 years learn to be loyal. Completely, impersonally, with their eyes fixed on the symbol, rather than the person wearing it. When Privy Councillor Oreth Vassam gave the order, every one of those officers had a choice. They made theirs in under 10 seconds. The corridor emptied the way a tide empties a channel, smoothly, with the terrible efficiency of water finding lower ground. Boots on deck plating, the hiss of pressure doors, and then the silence of a space that had been full of people, and wasn't anymore. I stood in the doorway of the medical bay, and watched them go. There is a particular quality to that kind of silence. I had encountered it before, in different configurations. In field hospitals when the front line moved and the support staff followed it, leaving the ones who couldn't move behind with whoever chose to stay. It is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of a subtraction. You can feel the shape of what was there. My name is Darrow Fenn. At the time of these events I held the rank of Coalition Liaison Surgeon, attached to the Imperial Vavre Garrison as the sole human representative of the Terran Coalition Medical Corps, a posting that had been created 6 years prior, mostly as a diplomatic gesture, and which had consisted largely of treating minor injuries, attending quarterly briefings, and eating a great deal of food that disagreed with my digestion. I was 38 years old. I had a folding photograph of my mother's house in the breast pocket of my uniform, a habit I had maintained since field training, because I had been told by a senior medic in my first posting that you should always carry something that reminds you who you were before the work, so the work doesn't become the only thing that defines you. I was, in every official capacity, a peripheral figure, an appendix to the garrison's formal structure, a human in a very large alien institution, present for the optics more than the function. None of that mattered at the third bell of the night watch, because none of them had stayed, and I had. I want to tell this carefully, because the story is not about heroism. Anyone who tells you I stayed out of heroism has not met me and is not paying attention. I stayed because I had a patient on the table, or near enough the table. She was on the floor actually, having been moved there from the ceremonial dais, when her legs stopped working. And I had not finished what I was doing. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that medicine trains into you over time, a refusal to abandon an assessment midstream, and I had been trained thoroughly. The evacuation order was a loud thing. The woman bleeding on my floor was a louder thing. That is the complete explanation. I have never found a more complicated one, and I have looked. The Empress Valeth Soren of the Vethara Conclave was 41 years old by their calendar, which translated to approximately 36 in mine. She had ruled the conclave for 11 years, inheriting the seat after her predecessor's long illness and holding it through 2 territorial disputes, a currency crisis, and 1 attempted coup, the last having occurred approximately 4 hours before I stood in that doorway watching her guards leave. The blade had been poisoned. The poison was not Vetheran. The intelligence implications of that were above my pay grade, and above the pay grade of most people still alive on the station. And so I set that thought aside and focused on what was in front of me. What was in front of me was a woman with blue-gray skin and close-cropped dark hair, lying on the cold deck plating of the Imperial Medical Bay, conscious but barely, one hand pressed to the wound in her side where the blade had gone in. Her copper-gold eyes were open. They tracked me when I moved. That was good. The tracking was good. I had been watching those eyes since I came through the bay door 40 minutes earlier, during the initial chaos before the evacuation order arrived, and they had always been tracking, always been present, and that told me things about the wound and the person both. Her 2 remaining attendants had left with the evacuation wave. The medical officer, a veteran physician of considerably more experience than me, had filed his treatment notes, administered what he could, and then followed his chain of command out the door. His notes said the prognosis was uncertain, and that survival depended on continued monitoring and intervention. He had written that, closed his terminal, picked up his kit, and left. I had watched him leave from across the room. He had not looked at me on his way out. I had read the notes. Then I had put on gloves and knelt beside the Empress. She watched me do it. The copper-gold eyes tracked every movement. There was no fear in them. I noted that early and kept noting it because it changed how I worked. Some patients panic, and panic complicates everything. The panic is understandable, even reasonable, but it makes the work harder because now you are managing two things instead of one: the wound and the person's response to the wound. Valith Soren did not panic. She lay on the cold deck plating of her own medical bay in the station she had governed for 11 years, abandoned by everyone she was responsible for, and she watched a human stranger pull on examination gloves with the steady, measuring gaze of a woman taking inventory of a situation she had not yet decided was lost. "Your physician left," she said. Her galactic standard was precise, lightly accented, constructed with the care of someone who had learned it formally rather than absorbed it through immersion. The care was not affectation. It was the care of a person who valued exactness, who believed that words should mean the things they said. "He did," I said. "My guard left." "Yes. The Privy Council has declared the station compromised." Her voice was level. The levelness was costing her something. I could see it in the set of her jaw, the controlled pace of her breathing. "Evacuation protocol requires all non-essential personnel to withdraw to the secondary command vessel pending resolution." "I read the protocol," I said. The copper-gold eyes held on my face. "You are coalition staff. The protocol does not bind you." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." A silence in which I continued working. Pulling the portable scanner from the supply cabinet, running the preliminary sweep, reading the numbers with the focused attention that blocks out ambient noise. The numbers were not ideal. They were also not unsurvivable, which was the relevant category. "Then why?" she said. "Are you still here?" I looked up at her. She was watching me with an expression I could not fully read. It was complex in the way that expressions are complex when the person wearing them is holding several things in check at once. There was the pain, carefully managed. There was something that might have been calculation, or might have been something closer to wonder. And there was the particular quality of stillness that I later came to understand as the Empress's version of asking a question she already half knew the answer to, but needed to hear spoken aloud, because the spoken version mattered in a way the unspoken one didn't. "Because you're bleeding," I said, "and I know how to help with that." She looked at me for another moment. Then she made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and settled her shoulders more carefully against the cabinet she was leaning against, adjusting her position with the deliberate care of a person who has had enough pain to understand how to move economically within it. "Then help," she said. So I did. The Vithara seat is in its operational prime. One of the older orbital installations in the mid-ring territories. It had been constructed over 3 centuries prior as a combined administrative and residential complex, the seat of Vetheran imperial governance in the literal sense. The Empress lived there, held court there, conducted the daily business of governing a territory that spanned 14 populated worlds, and something on the order of 4 billion people. The corridors were wide and high, built to the proportions of a culture that believed architecture communicated authority, which it does, if you build it right and maintain it long enough. The main hall had ceilings that made you aware of the smallness of your own concerns. I had walked those corridors for 4 years and never quite stopped noticing the scale. The station was also, as of the 3rd bell of the night watch, dying. The assassination attempt had triggered more than just an injury. The blade had been a delivery mechanism for a signal device, military grade, sophisticated, and not manufactured anywhere in the conclave, that had broadcast a code packet to the station's primary systems on activation. By the time the medical officer had stabilized the Empress and the security detail had secured the chamber, the station's power grid was already beginning a cascading shutdown. Not catastrophic, not explosive, deliberate, a slow erasure. Systems going dark one by one in a sequence designed to maximize disruption, while minimizing the kind of obvious violence that might have provoked an immediate military response from the fleet elements currently within range. The primary life support was on the secondary grid. It was not affected. We had air and we had heat, both of which mattered considerably more than anything else at that point. What we did not have, increasingly, was light. The emergency illumination strips activated when the main panels failed, casting everything in amber red, the color of low warning. It made the medical bay look like a photograph taken through smoked glass. It made the shelving units along the walls into dark architectural shapes, and the equipment into shadow-edged masses of function. It made the Empress look, when I glanced up from my work, like something out of an old painting. The blue-gray of her skin warming in the amber, Light. The copper gold of her eyes, catching the emergency strips and throwing the color back at me with a clarity that was, in context, both useful and distracting. I focused on the work. The poison in the blade was a compound I recognized from the medical literature on veteran physiology. I had studied it, as I had studied everything relevant to the species I was assigned to support, with the methodical thoroughness of a person who understood that their value in this posting was precisely proportional to their preparation. It was a coagulant disruptor. Left untreated, it would prevent the wound from closing and degrade tissue integrity at the cellular level over 12 to 16 hours. Treated with the correct counteragent and physical intervention, it was survivable. The physician had administered the first stage of the counteragent before he left. Credit to him for that. Whatever else I thought about his decision to follow the order. I had the second stage in the supply cabinet. The physical intervention required pressure, precision, and time. I had all three. I had nothing but time. "You are the human," she said, perhaps an hour into the work. Not unkindly, with the tone of someone stating an observed fact while assembling a larger picture. "Darofen," I said, "Coalition Liaison Surgeon." "I know your name," she said. "I mean that you are the human. There is only one human attached to this garrison." "That's correct." "I have read your file," she said. "Coalition Medical Corps. Field certification in 3 specializations. Posted here 4 years, 3 months. On a diplomatic secondment formally classified as non-essential advisory liaison. 4 years, 5 months," I said. A pause. "You keep count." "Habit," I said. "I keep count of most things. Duration of postings, dosing intervals, temperature drop rates. Numbers tend to matter when you're trying to keep track of what's changed." She considered this. "You count the months," she said, "because you are aware of them." "I'm aware of most things," I said. "I've found it serves better than the alternative." She was quiet for a moment. A different quality of quiet than the Earth's silences, more like a person settling into a new assessment. Outside the bay, the station was making sounds it hadn't made before. Not alarming sounds. Exactly. More the sounds of a large installation adjusting to the loss of its primary systems. The subtle shifts in pressure differential and temperature that come when you remove half a grid's worth of regulation. Structural material, doing what structural material does when the conditions around it change. Flexing incrementally, redistributing load, finding the new equilibrium. I was tracking those sounds with part of my attention, while keeping most of it on the work in front of me. The part that was tracking noted the rate of change, and concluded we had time. Probably enough time. I did not say that aloud, because probably enough is not the sentence you say to the person whose life depends on the margin. "The Privy Council believes I will not survive," she said. It was stated as a fact, without particular emotion attached to it. The tone of someone reporting a datum they find personally objectionable, but professionally relevant. "The Privy Council left," I said. "They had the physician's prognosis." "Prognoses are assessments of probability," I said. "They're not verdicts." The physician was competent. His prognosis was based on what he knew at the time he wrote it. "I know more now." The copper gold eyes moved to my face. "And what do you know now?" "That the compound is responding to the counteragent at a rate that's better than the standard model predicts. Your tissue regeneration pathway is faster than average for your species. Measurably faster, not marginally. The wound itself is clean. Whatever else the blade was, it was sharp. Clean wounds close better than torn ones. Your vital signs have stabilized in the last 40 minutes. They were not stable when I came in." I looked up at her. "Your odds are better than when he wrote that prognosis. Meaningfully better." She studied me with the fullness of attention that I was beginning to understand was not a diplomatic technique or a practiced performance of engagement. It was simply how she listened, how she had always listened, which was completely, as though the person speaking to her was the only person in the world worth hearing at that moment. "You believe that," she said. "Not a question." "I don't say things I don't believe," I said. "I find it wastes time and tends to cost you later. Most people," she said carefully, "tell me what they believe I want to hear." "I noticed," I said. 4 years is long enough to notice." Something moved in the copper gold eyes. I went back to my work. I want to try to describe what the next several hours were like, because they don't fit neatly into any category I had available to me at the time, and I've spent considerable effort in the years since trying to find the right words for them. It was not comfortable. The deck was hard and cold, even through the cushioning I had pulled from a supply shelf. The emergency lighting was harsh and narrow, and the station was gradually losing secondary systems in ways that required periodic management. I had to reset 2 atmospheric regulators manually by climbing into a service corridor with a handlight, a task that would have been considerably easier if I were built to the same ergonomic specifications as the maintenance panels. My hands were the right size, as it happened, for the veteran equipment. That had always been one of the incidental advantages of the posting. Everything else about me was wrong-shaped for the place, but my hands fit the tools. It was not easy in the way some stories make isolated hours with another person sound easy, as though the removal of the outside world automatically produces intimacy, as though 2 people alone in a small space will naturally and swiftly arrive at understanding. That is not how it works. She was the ruler of 14 worlds in a medical crisis, and I was the man keeping her alive, and both of those facts carried weights that did not simply dissolve in the amber light. The first hours were careful hours. We spoke in the way that a physician and a patient speak, purposefully, with the conversation serving the work. But there was something else there, something that grew slowly in the silences between the clinical exchanges. The way things grow in places where there is no competition for the light, where the usual noise has been removed and what remains is simply 2 people and the facts of their situation. She asked questions, not the questions I expected. Not questions about my treatment plan, or the station's status, or the probability that rescue would come before secondary systems degraded further. Those questions she asked too, and I answered them directly, but they were not the questions that stayed in the room after they were answered. She asked about me, about Earth, about how long I had been off-world, about what I had studied and why I had ended up in military medicine rather than civilian practice, about whether I had family, about what I had made in 4 years of the conclave, its rhythms, its logic, the texture of living inside its periphery. I answered honestly, which is how I always answer, and I think the honesty was part of what she was measuring. I think she was a person who had spent 20 years surrounded by people who told her what they believed she wanted to hear, and who had developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting the difference between that and a person simply saying what was true. The instrument was good. I trusted it more as the hours passed. I told her I thought the conclave was impressive and overcomplicated. I told her I thought its bureaucratic architecture was beautiful in the way certain machines are beautiful. Intricate, precisely engineered, completely unintuitive to anyone who hadn't grown up inside it, with the result that it did its job but resisted being understood by anyone who approached it from outside. I told her I had spent 4 years feeling like a person reading a very dense book in a language I was technically fluent in, but had never quite mastered the idioms of. I told her the food had been a genuine trial, but that I had eventually found 3 dishes I liked. She laughed at that. A real laugh, careful with the pain but real, the first time I had heard it, and it was a good sound. It had edges to it and warmth in the middle, the laugh of a person who does not do it carelessly. And so each time it happens, you feel the weight of it. 3 dishes, she repeated. In 4 years and 5 months. I'm a methodical person, I said. I don't rush to conclusions. No, she said. I see that. She told me things, too. Not in the way that she had been briefed to tell things to a coalition liaison. Not the official account, the curated version, the one with the sharp edges sanded down for interspecies diplomatic consumption, and the inconvenient details distributed across footnotes where they wouldn't interrupt the preferred narrative. She told me what it had actually been like to inherit the seat at 30 years old, with the empire in the middle of a currency crisis, and half the Privy Council convinced she wasn't up to the work, and the other half waiting, with varying degrees of patience, to find out. She told me about the territorial disputes and what had actually driven them, which was considerably more complicated than the public record suggested, and involved 3 factions, and a resource contract that predated the current governing framework by 60 years. She told me about the first coup attempt, which I had heard the official version of, and which had apparently left out several crucial details, including the fact that she had been the one to end it personally, by walking into the negotiating chamber in the middle of the night and refusing to leave until the faction leaders agreed to talk. No guards. Just her and her own certainty that the institution was worth preserving. I listened to all of it. I listened the way I had always listened to patients, fully, without the part of my mind already composing a response, because the most important diagnostic tool I have ever had is a patient who feels heard enough to tell me the truth about what is wrong. You cannot diagnose what you do not know. You cannot know what people do not tell you. People do not tell you things when they sense you are waiting for them to finish speaking. But she wasn't a patient, exactly. Not only that, and somewhere in the fourth or fifth hour, in the amber quiet of a station that was slowly going dark around us, I stopped thinking of her as a patient at all, and started thinking of her as what she was. A person I was coming to know, in the particular way that you come to know someone when every usual social structure has been removed. And what remains is simply the two of you and the necessity of honesty. "Why do you do this?" she asked at one point. It was the second or third time she had circled back toward the question, approaching it from different angles the way a person will when they're working towards something they're not sure how to say directly. "Medicine?" I said. "Staying," she said. "You could have gone. There would have been no consequence. The coalition would have recorded it as following: evacuation protocol. The garrison would have recorded it as appropriate conduct. No one would have thought less of you. You had every institutional reason to leave, and no institutional reason to remain." I was checking the scanner readout at the time. I set it down carefully and looked at her. "I know that," I said. "Then why?" I thought about it. I try not to give answers I haven't thought about, because quick answers are usually the ones that sound right, but mean the least. The right answer was in there somewhere. I could feel the shape of it, and I wanted to give her the right one. "Because the reason I do medicine," I said finally, "is that I think every person deserves someone who will stay. In the hard part. Not because they've earned it, not because of who they are, or what rank they hold, or what institution they represent. Just because they're a person, and they're in the hard part, and staying is the right thing to do." I paused. "That's as true for the Empress of 14 Worlds as it is for anyone else. It doesn't scale with rank. It doesn't get dispensed in proportion to status, it's just what you do." She was very still. I was also, I added, genuinely not finished with what I was doing. I have professional standards, and it would bother me for years if I left something incomplete. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, in the careful standard of a person choosing words with precision, "No one has said that to me before." "Which part?" "Any of it," she said, "in the way you said it, as if it were simply obvious." "It is obvious," I said. "I'm not sure why it requires saying." "Because in my experience," she said, "the obvious things are frequently the ones no one says." I didn't have a good answer for that. I was not a man who navigated those kinds of moments with any particular grace. I had spent 4 years on the periphery of a court that operated in registers I understood intellectually and managed socially, and I had learned to be honest in that context by simply not attempting to be anything else. So I picked up the scanner again and went back to work, and I did not look at her face, though I was aware of her watching me for a long time afterward. The 7th hour was the hard one. The secondary power grid had been failing incrementally throughout the night. Losing non-essential systems first, as designed, working inward toward the critical ones, with the patient, methodical logic of a system that had been built by someone who understood how to dismantle things slowly. At the 7th hour, the atmospheric regulation on our deck dropped into the marginal zone. Not dangerous. Not immediately. We had air and we had enough residual warmth that the readings were still acceptable. But the temperature was declining at a measurable rate, and declining temperature was something I needed to account for, because the Empress's physiology was more sensitive to cold than mine, and because the healing process I had set in motion required stable conditions to proceed correctly. The counteragent worked within a temperature range. Below that range it worked more slowly. Slower was the wrong direction. I had 4 emergency thermal sheets in the supply cabinet. I wrapped her in 3 of them, made her as comfortable as the hard floor permitted, and checked the temperature readings at 30-minute intervals. Then I went to the service corridor with the maintenance manual I had pulled from the emergency database and my handlight, and spent a significant amount of time attempting to reroute a portion of power from the entertainment and data systems, neither of which was going to matter in the near term, to the atmospheric regulation unit. I am not an engineer. I have never claimed to be an engineer. I can read a manual carefully and execute the steps it describes, which is what I did. And the regulation unit stabilized at acceptable levels approximately 40 minutes after I started. Whether that was skill or luck or some combination of the two, I will not speculate. I called it sufficient and moved on. She watched me work throughout all of this. The copper gold eyes had never stopped being alert, even in the hours when the pain medication in her Systems should have made her drowsy. They stayed open, steady, tracking me across the room as I moved between tasks. It was the tracking of a person who has decided to pay attention, who has found that the act of paying attention is one of the few things still within their control, and who is exercising that control with great care. "You are frightened," she said, during the 7th hour. I had come back from the service corridor and was reviewing the temperature log. I stopped. I turned to look at her. "A little," I said. "But you are still working." "Yes." A pause. "Does the fear help?" I thought about that honestly, because it was an honest question. "It keeps me accurate," I said. "Fear is information. It's telling me that the margin is smaller than I'd like, that the usual assumptions about time and options don't fully apply. I use that to be more careful, more precise. The fear sharpens the attention when it needs to be sharp." I paused. The problem is when people treat fear as a reason to stop rather than a reason to be more careful. She was quiet for a moment then. "I have been told, since I was young, that good rulers do not show fear, that it undermines the confidence of the people around you." "With respect," I said, "that seems like advice designed to benefit the people giving it more than the person receiving it." The copper-gold eyes warmed. It was visible. A subtle shift, like the change when a cloud moves off the sun. "It is," she said. "I have always thought so. But it is the advice one receives, repeatedly, from people who have a stake in your composure." "Fear and competence aren't mutually exclusive," I said. "I've been afraid in medical emergencies for 20 years. I've also been effective in them. The two things coexist without any particular difficulty. The fear isn't the problem. Letting the fear make the decisions, treating the fear as instruction rather than information, that's the problem." She looked at me with the quality of attention that I had stopped trying to classify and had simply started accepting as something this particular person did. A fullness of attention that most people in positions of authority reserve for other people in positions of authority, and which she gave to me as though rank were not a relevant variable, as though the person speaking to her were the only criterion. "Daro Fen," she said. "Yes. I am glad you stayed." I held her gaze for a moment. It was not a small thing she was saying. The copper-gold eyes were clear and direct, and they meant it completely, and I understood that. "I know," I said. And then, because it was true and she deserved to hear true things, "I'm glad I stayed too." Rescue arrived 11 hours after the evacuation. The secondary command vessel had jumped to the nearest relay point, transmitted the crisis report to the Conclave Military Command, and waited for a response. The waiting had taken longer than it should have. I gathered this later, from the reconstruction, and found I did not think about it with the anger some people expected me to feel. The Privy Council's deliberation about whether to authorize the rescue mission had been influenced by several parties who had run their own calculations about what the Empress's survival would mean for various ongoing succession and factional arrangements, and those parties had needed to be overruled. The overruling had been accomplished by the senior military admiral of the Conclave fleet, Myrith Sorvan, who had apparently reviewed the situation report, informed the Privy Council that she was dispatching a vessel with or without their authorization, and suggested that the constitutional questions could be discussed at whatever length they preferred once the Empress was safe. I have great respect for Admiral Sorvan on the basis of that single reported action. I told her so when I met her, and she looked at me with the expression of a person who does not particularly need respect, but receives it honestly, and so finds it tolerable. The rescue team came through the main corridor airlock at the 11th hour. 12 of them, military medical personnel, security detail, 2 engineering officers for the power systems. They moved with the clean efficiency of people who had been briefed thoroughly and were executing on a clear plan. The team leader was a Vatharan military physician named Sorvath, senior rank, controlled expression, the kind of competent that announces itself by not announcing itself. She came through the door, swept the bay with the practiced assessment of a physician accounting for a scene, and then her eyes landed on me. There was a pause. "Coalition Liaison Surgeon Fen," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at the scanner readout I handed her. She looked at the wound site. She looked at the atmospheric readings I had logged at 30-minute intervals throughout the night, and at the maintenance record I had compiled for the regulation unit work, and at the complete medication and monitoring log going back to the moment I had pulled on gloves and begun. She was quiet for a long moment. "This is your work," she said. "Yes, all of it." "All of it," I said. "The physician's first-stage counteragent is noted in the record. Everything after that point is mine. Another pause. It is good work, she said, with the precision of someone who assesses work and does not use the word lightly. Thank you, I said. The transfer of care took the next hour. I briefed Sorvith on everything: treatment timeline, counteragent dosing, and the adjustment I had made to the second stage schedule based on the regeneration rate data, the atmospheric situation and my engineering intervention and its outcome, the temperature records, all of it. She asked sharp questions, and I gave her sharp answers. And the briefing had the quality of a professional exchange between two people who were both taking it seriously. Somewhere in the middle of it, I became aware that the Empress was watching us both from her position on the thermal sheeted floor, and that the copper gold eyes had a quality I had not seen in them all night. Something quieter and more contained, something that had moved past the long vigilance of the dark hours into a new register I did not yet have a name for. When the transfer was complete, when Sorvith's team had done their own assessment and confirmed the record, and begun the careful preparations for moving the Empress to the rescue vessel, Valith Soren reached out and put her hand on my arm. I looked down at it and then up at her. Her copper gold eyes were very clear. The amber emergency lighting was still on. The engineering officers were working on the power systems but hadn't yet restored the main panels. And, in that light, her face had the quality of something I wanted to remember and knew I would. I want to say something to you, she said, before they take me away from this room. Of course, I said. I have ruled for 11 years, she said. In 11 years I have received the loyalty of my court, the service of my guard, the counsel of my advisors. I have received all of these things from many people, and they have been genuine offerings, freely given by individuals who believed in the institution they served. She paused, choosing what came next carefully. I did not, until tonight, understand the difference between being served by people who believe in the institution and being chosen by a person who simply believes in you. The room was very quiet. The rescue team was working, doing their tasks with professional efficiency, but they were doing it in the careful way that people move when they sense something important is happening nearby and they want to give it the space it requires. You didn't know me, she said. You had no personal loyalty to this station, no cultural obligation to stay, no authority requiring it. You stayed because you decided I was worth staying for, as a person, not as a title or a political entity or a diplomatic asset. The copper gold eyes held steady. I want you to know that I understand the difference, and that it is the most significant thing anyone has done for me in 11 years of rule. I was aware of a great many things at once. The rescue team pretending not to listen. My own heartbeat, which had been a calm background presence for 11 hours and had apparently decided that now was an appropriate moment to become noticeable. The photograph of my mother's house in my breast pocket, which I had not once thought about during the long night, and which now felt present and weighted in the way that objects feel present when you are in the middle of an experience you know you are going to carry. I'd have stayed for anyone in that bay, I said. I know, she said. That is exactly what I mean. The rescue vessel's medical bay was considerably better equipped than the station's had been, and Sorvith's team had the Empress stable and improving well before we made the jump to the Conclave's primary medical installation. I spent the transit in a passenger seat, writing up the formal incident report, a document I wanted to complete while the details were still precise, because I have learned that memory is not a reliable archive, and that the formal record matters. Sorvith came and sat beside me approximately 2 hours in. The counteragent dosing, she said, without preamble, the adjusted second stage schedule. That is not in the standard protocol. No, I said. The standard protocol is based on the median patient presentation. Her regeneration pathway was running significantly faster than median. I adjusted the dosing interval accordingly to maintain the therapeutic window. How did you know to look for that variation? I read everything available on veteran physiology when I got this posting, I said. And I paid attention to the scanner data in real time rather than assuming the initial assessment would hold. I glanced at her. It wasn't a difficult judgment. It just required having done the reading beforehand and being willing to update the plan when the data changed. Most physicians would have followed the standard protocol, she said. Most physicians had already left, I said, and I did not mean it as a criticism. It came out more tired than sharp, the simple accounting of a long night, rather than a judgment on individuals. But Sorvith looked at me for a moment and then looked away, and I thought I saw something in her expression that was more complicated than professional assessment. Yes, she said, they had. She left me to finish the report. I finished it, and then I slept, and when I woke, we were approaching the installation and the light through the viewport was the clean white of a functioning facility at full power, which was, after 11 hours of amber emergency strips, a color I found genuinely moving. The installation stay for the Empress was 14 days. I was given a room on the Coalition diplomatic wing and formally relieved of duty, pending a review of the evacuation incident, a review that the Coalition Liaison Office was careful to characterize as procedural rather than punitive, and which I understood to be the administrative machinery processing an event that didn't fit neatly into the existing categories. I submitted my reports, attended 3 debriefing sessions with 3 different administrative bodies, answered the same questions with the same answers, and then had a period of days in which I was not officially required to do anything. I read. I took walks through the installation's garden levels, which had the quality of spaces that are maintained technically but not tended to. Useful. Plants running to their own shapes, everything present that was required to be present, nothing quite thriving. I thought as I walked, in the way I think when I have a long problem and no immediate tasks competing with it. On the 9th day, a message arrived at my room. Brief, on official correspondence paper, in Valeth Saroon's precise handwriting. It said, if you have no obligations this afternoon, I would welcome your company for tea. I went. She was in a recovery suite on the 8th level, which was considerably better than the medical ward she had started in, and she looked considerably better than the last time I had seen her moving, under her own direction. The blue-gray of her skin had a health to it that I recognized from the scanner projections, the copper-gold eyes alert and clear in the daylight, coming through the suite's wide windows. She was sitting at a proper table in a proper chair, and there was tea, and when I came in she looked at me, with an expression I could read without any difficulty this time at all. We talked for 3 hours. The shape of it was different from the amber dark of the station, less urgent, more spacious, with the quality of a conversation between people who have established something and are now exploring its dimensions without the pressure of necessity. The tea was good, which surprised me. I had not found much on the conclave that agreed with me, and I had mostly stopped being surprised by that, but the tea was genuinely good, and I told her so, and she told me it was from a producer on the 6th world who had been growing it for 40 years in the same soil with the same methods, and that she had been drinking it every morning for 11 years, and that some things were worth continuing simply because they were worth doing. I thought about that for a moment. You brought it with you, I said. Here, I have it everywhere I go, she said. There are things you carry. I thought of the photograph in my breast pocket. Yes, I said. There are. She told me about the investigation into the assassination attempt, ongoing and not yet at liberty to be discussed in detail, and about the political realignments the crisis had already begun to produce. She spoke about the Privy Council, with the directness of someone who has finished being diplomatic about a particular subject, and decided that plainness serves better, naming the people who had delayed the rescue authorization without naming them, which I understood, and naming what they had calculated without flinching from the calculation's implications. She spoke about what came next, the work of returning, the work of rebuilding the trust that the evacuation had demonstrated was not, in several key individuals, actually present. The Admiral, I said. Sorvan, who sent the rescue. She will have a significantly enlarged role, the Empress said, with the tone of someone who has already decided something, and is simply informing the other party of the outcome. She acted on her own assessment of what was right, without waiting for authorization from people who were calculating rather than deciding. A pause. I find I have great respect for that quality. I noticed, I said. The copper-gold eyes held on mine, with the warmth that lived in them now as a permanent feature, no longer the careful assessing warmth of the medical bay, but something more settled, more sure of itself. Darrow, she said, my given name, without the rank. She had used it exactly twice since the night on the station, and each time it had a different weight. This time the weight was the good kind. Yes, I said. I want to ask you something. All right. When the rescue team arrived, she said, when the transfer was complete and you could have walked away. What were you feeling in that moment, specifically? I looked at the window and thought about it properly, the way the question deserved. Relieved, I said, that you were going to be all right, that the work had held. that the decisions I made in the night had been the right ones, and that the margin I had been working within had been sufficient. I paused. And something else. What else? Something I don't have a clean category for, I said. Something that felt like not wanting the conversation to end, not wanting to stop knowing you, the work being complete, and finding that I had not been ready for it to be complete, which was a surprise, because I am usually ready to be done when the work is done. I looked at the table. That part surprised me. The suite was very quiet. It did not surprise me, she said. I looked at her. I have been in many rooms, she said, with many people who were present because presence was their function, who performed engagement as a professional duty and did it well. You were simply present because you decided to be. Her voice was level and direct and meant every word. I find I do not want to stop either. What followed was not simple. I will not tell you that it was. Nothing in this territory is simple when the territory involves the ruler of 14 worlds and a coalition surgeon whose planet was a mid-tier diplomatic partner, with no particular leverage and no romantic tradition of interspecies alliance. The institutional complications were real and extended and sometimes exhausting. The Privy Council's response when the shape of things became clearer was prolonged and involved committees. The Coalition Liaison Office's response was more measured, but still required a significant number of formal exchanges. The distance was real. The work required to manage it was real. What I will say is that she was patient with all of it, in the way that 11 years of governance teaches. Patience, not passive, never passive, but patient with the understanding that institutions move slowly, and that the work of moving them is legitimate work, and that outcomes worth having generally require the effort of being pursued, rather than the luck of being handed over. And I was stubborn in the way I have always been stubborn. Quietly, without drama, with the specific stubbornness of someone who has decided something is true, and does not revise that assessment based on administrative inconvenience. The formal recognition ceremony was held 4 months after the night on the station. The new temporary seat, a diplomatic installation on the conclave's central world, had a main hall large enough for the full reconstituted court, which was smaller than the previous one, in certain respects, and considerably more reliable in the ones that mattered. I wore my coalition dress uniform, which was plainer than everything else in that room by a considerable margin, and I spent 20 minutes considering whether to obtain something more ceremonially appropriate before deciding that the Empress would not want me to be someone different, and that if I began adjusting myself to contexts, I would end up adjusted beyond recognition within a year. The ceremony was long and formal, and I paid attention throughout all of it, because paying attention is how I do things. There were investitures and readings, and the formal seating of the new advisory council, and Admiral Sorvan, whom I had now met 3 times and liked enormously, took her seat with the expression of someone who has no interest in the theater and considerable interest in the work. The recognition came near the end. Valith Sorun stood at the head of the chamber in the full regalia of her office, the formal robes in deep blue and copper, the ancient crown that her line had carried for 3 centuries. The copper-gold eyes very clear in the installation's formal light. The hall was full. The silence of it, when she began to speak about the night on the station, had a different quality from the silences I had known. The silence of hundreds of people who have decided, collectively, to listen. She told the court what had happened. She was precise and accurate, and she named everything I had done without diplomatic softening, in the level, direct voice that was her truest register. And then she said what she said. That she wished to state, before the full court, that she was alive because one person had chosen to stay. Not from obligation but from a decision about what a person in front of him was worth, and that this was not a small thing, that this was in her belief the most fundamental thing, the ground beneath every other good act. She held my gaze across the length of the hall while she said it. The room was very quiet. I have been in many rooms in the years since, and I have not found one where I felt the weight of being seen as clearly as I felt it in that moment. Not seen as a function or a liaison or a representative of an institution, but seen as whatever I actually was, by someone who had had 11 hours of amber dark to decide what that was and had come to her conclusion and was now saying it aloud in front of everyone. I held her gaze. I did not look away. The formal recognition came with decorations and a restructured appointment and all the administrative machinery that follows such things, and all of it was processed in due course. I navigated the reception afterward with the particular combination of determination and limited social grace that I had been refining for 4 years. And people spoke to me in the new way that people speak to someone when an institution is recalibrating its understanding of what they are. And I answered them honestly, because that is the register I have. She found me near the end of it, when the room had thinned enough to stand by a window without 12 observers. The city outside was full of lights, ordinary city lights. The inhabited world going about its ordinary inhabited life. Full of people who did not know what had happened 4 months ago in an amber-lit medical bay and did not need to. A city at night is a reassuring thing I have always found. The lights mean that people have made decisions about where they will be, and are being there, and that the infrastructure required to support all of those decisions is functioning. It is the sum of 100,000 choices to remain, and it is, viewed from the right window in the right company, genuinely beautiful. "How are you?" she asked. It was a real question. She always asked real questions. "I'm good," I said. And then, because it was true and I had stopped softening true things, "I'm very good, actually." She stood beside me at the window, not touching. The court was still present in the room behind us, and there would be time for the contexts that permitted touching, but beside me in the way that had become natural over the months, the particular ease of two people who have been in a very small space together at a very important time, and have never quite lost the comfort of that proximity. "This took a long time," she said. "Yes, institutions move slowly. Are you bothered by that?" "No," I said, honestly. I waited 4 months after 11 hours of amber dark, and before that I spent 4 years on the periphery of a place that didn't think my function was necessary. I know how to wait for outcomes that are worth waiting for. I looked at her. The work doesn't change based on whether people think it matters. The outcome is what matters. Outside, the city lights did what city lights do. They held the dark back and made the inhabited world visible. And that is enough, most of the time. That is a great deal, in fact, when you think about it with any seriousness. "Darrow," she said, "yes. I am going to say something, and I want you to hear it without deflecting it into professional context or framing it as merely obvious." I turned to look at her fully. "I am glad," she said, "every single day, that you are the kind of person who stays, not because it saved my life, though it did, but because of who it showed you to be. And because knowing you, knowing what you are, simply and without apology, has shown me something about what I could be, in the parts of my life that are not governance." She held my gaze with the copper gold eyes that had been watching me since the amber dark of a dying station, that had never once looked away from anything I said. I did not know I was missing that. I know it now. The reception noise was very far away. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly what I mean. I have told this story in pieces at debriefs, at reviews, once at a Coalition Medical Corps commendation, where I was asked to say something, and kept it brief, because I have never been entirely comfortable with the ceremony of things, only with the things themselves. I have told it now in full, because I think the full version is the one worth having. The Vathara seat was repaired over 2 years and returned to operation. The investigation concluded with prosecutions and restructuring. The Privy Council was reformed into something that functioned better. The conclave governed, as it had governed for 3 centuries, and the governing was the work, and the work continued. I continued to work. My posting expanded into something with real structural purpose, a coalition medical presence that had genuine function, genuine need, genuine work to do. I did the work because the work does not change based on whether people think it matters, and I have always known it matters. Some nights I think about the photograph of my mother's house, still in my breast pocket where it has always been. I think about amber emergency lighting and cold deck plating, and the copper gold of eyes that were measuring and being measured in the long dark, and what it felt like to be, for the first time in 4 years, visible as something other than peripheral. I think about what it means to stay when staying is not required, what it makes of you, what it reveals to the other person, not as a gift but simply as a fact. Here is what I am, here is what I decided, here is what you are worth to me, and how that fact, spoken by nothing more than remaining, can be the most complete sentence a person ever delivers. Not heroism, not sacrifice exactly. Just a decision made in a specific moment by a specific person about what is right, acted on without ceremony, without anyone watching, with only the cold deck and the amber light as witness. That is the thing, I think. That is the whole of what it is. I think about how she said, in the morning after the ceremony, in a room with no one else in it, You are the first person in 11 years who has seen me as a person first. And I told her what I have always believed, which is that there is nothing remarkable about that. That the work of seeing a person as a person is not a gift, it is a minimum, it is the floor, the ground beneath every other decent act. The thing you owe to every human being you stand next to in the dark. And she said, yes, I know, that is the remarkable part. I have been told by people who study these things that the history of the Veteran Conclave's relationship with the Terran Coalition shifted meaningfully after the events described here. That the restructured liaison framework changed the texture of a dozen subsequent negotiations. That the ceremony was cited in diplomatic literature as a turning point. I take all of that seriously, because I think it is probably true, and because I think the things that come from recognition tend to be larger than the recognition itself, which is part of what makes recognition worth offering. But when I come home at the end of a long day, and the copper gold eyes find mine across whatever room we are in, it is not the diplomatic history I am thinking about. It is not the decorations, or the committees, or the 17 administrative processes that came before. It is the amber light and the cold deck, and the sound of a station settling quietly around two people who were all that was left of everyone who been there. It is the simple fact of staying. That is the whole of it. That is all it ever was.